From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It began before he'd even been elected. On the campaign trail last year, Donald Trump had a message for NATO countries who weren't pulling their weight.
The presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
If European politicians were hoping that those might just be the bombastic words of a campaign speech, they've now had plenty of reason to think again.
We can talk all we want about values. Values are important. But you can't shoot values. Leaders of our European allies should take primary responsibility for defense of the continent.
As President Trump has made abundantly clear, he believes that our European friends must play a bigger role in the future of this continent. We don't think, you hear this term, burden sharing, but we think it's an important part of being in a shared alliance together that the Europeans step up while America focuses on areas of the world that are in great danger.
For much of Europe, it's been a wake-up call.
We are in an era of rearmament. And Europe is ready to massively boost its defense spending, both to respond to the short-term urgency to act and to support Ukraine, but also to address the long-term need to take on more responsibility for our own European security.
So what should our leaders be preparing for? How much more dangerous is the world today, and how might we experience it?
A lot of people still look at the map and think that there's a lot of Europe in between us and Russia and in between us and where any fighting might be. The sad fact is, inconveniently, the world is not flat. So when Russian aircraft fly around the top of Norway, Russian bomber pilots call it flying around the corner, they've actually got a straight shot within range to the UK.
And if it was to happen, just describe what it would look like. If you were on the ground in a British city, what would you experience? How much warning would you have?
There are mixed versions of how much warning anybody would have of an incoming Russian missile strike if it came without war or warning, but it is counted in minutes. So the first thing that most people would know, because there is no warning system in place for alerting people to what is going on, is explosions happening.
The story today: is Europe ready for war?
I'm Keir Giles. I'm a professional Russia watcher. I've been doing it for several decades and developed an unfortunate habit of saying exactly what Russia is going to do before it does it, and then writing another book later to explain what comes next. The most recent one in that cycle is called Who Will Defend Europe? And it describes exactly the situation that we've got today, with the combination of Russian determination and American disengagement and Western European disinterest in defending itself. The last of those three looks like it's beginning to change, but of course, whether it can change fast enough is another question.
Keir, it does seem like a really timely book. You couldn't have picked a better subject. It feels like the moment for ordinary members of the public to really realise that things had changed was probably that disastrous meeting between Donald Trump, J.D. Vance and President Zelensky in the Oval Office.
You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having
not
cards.
Playing cards.
But right now, you don't.
You're
playing cards.
Mr. President.
You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the
president
lives of millions of people.
You're
gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
Do you think that might turn out to be the moment Ukraine lost the war?
The moment Ukraine may have lost the war, and let's not forget they are a long, long way from that at the moment, was not the confirmation of Ukraine's worst suspicions during that meeting in the Oval Office. Instead, it was the point at which Donald Trump was elected president.
We will be the envy of every nation, and we will not allow ourselves to be taken advantage of any longer. During every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first.
You mentioned at the start what a Russian strike in Britain would look like. Give us a sense of what Russia might do if it was to expand its war beyond Ukraine. What do you think might happen over the next few months? Which countries might be vulnerable? What might they do next?
There are always prime candidates that come up in the answers to these questions, and they tend very often to be the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, for a number of different geographical and military reasons. But the real answer is that this is a shifting equation, and everything changes over time. There are some things that we know are constant, and one of them is Vladimir Putin and Russia's ambition to reconstitute the empire, to regain control, whether it's through direct military occupation or through political control of the places that they think should be under Moscow's domination and that we think are sovereign, independent countries and members of the EU and NATO.
Europe does not have a developed early warning system. In this sense, they are more or less defenseless. Our tactical nuclear weapons are 3 to 4 times more powerful than the ones that the Americans dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And we could see a playing out of the same process that we saw for Ukraine at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022, when leaders from Europe and from the United States trooped to Moscow in procession to try to cajole Vladimir Putin out of invading Ukraine, knowing perfectly well that he would, but not actually presenting any deterrent, and effectively saying, we know precisely what you're going to do, but we're not going to do anything about it.
A lot of people think if they did that, it would almost be testing NATO to see if it works, given that they are members of NATO. Take us back to the start of NATO. This is sort of something which is talked about so much at the moment, and about whether its expansion has almost sort of been a threat to Russia. But just remind us of how it began and what the terms are that basically deter wars.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there because a lot has changed since 1949 when NATO was first set up. The basic premise of NATO was encapsulated in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which says that an attack on one member has to be considered as an attack against all. And implicit in that, if countries that are in NATO honor the spirit of that agreement, is a unified response to deter and repel and punish the attacker. Now, the problem comes, of course, because what that Article 5 goes on to say is not that countries have to act. It says simply that countries must do whatever action they deem necessary until peace and security is restored.
And Keir, as you said, with Article 5, if you were to keep with the spirit of what it means, any attack on a NATO member would mean the others have to step up. If there was some kind of attack on one of those countries, like Estonia, that would test NATO. It would test whether it still is a functioning organisation, whether it still would trigger the same sort of response it would have done 10 years ago. However, it comes at a time where we're hearing all sorts of messages out of the White House which don't feel like they're committed to protecting Europe against Russia. We've also had Elon Musk tweeting that he doesn't really know why the US is even a member of NATO. If there was an attack on one of those countries, do you think that would be the end for the organisation?
Well, the scenario you're describing is the classic, simple playbook that has been described as a fait accompli scenario, where Russia moves rapidly into a small portion of one of the Baltic states and then challenges NATO to respond. Traditionally, that would have been accompanied with dire threats of nuclear war from Russia, which previously was so effective in deterring particularly the United States from taking action in support of Ukraine. Now Russia has developed other capabilities as well, like the ones we were talking about earlier, extremely long-range conventional missile strikes to try to change countries' minds about whether or not they're going to respond. Now all of those scenarios have come roaring back. And the reason why is precisely because of this US vacillation. And of course, taken to its logical endpoint, if the United States does pull the rug from under NATO, whether through an explicit withdrawal or simply stating that it is not going to honor Article 5 or not cooperate in all of the NATO structures and headquarters where the United States is so deeply embedded, then Russia doesn't really need to challenge NATO at all, because once again, the Trump administration has done Moscow's work for it.
Are we ready for a post-NATO Europe? King Charles welcoming Volodymyr Zelensky to his Sandringham estate in images that evoke the days of Charles's grandfather when Britain bravely held down the fort before the US entered World War II. Ever since, the continent had relied on Washington's security umbrella. That is until now.
Keir, as you've just explained, at a time when NATO feels very insecure, and we know that the Russian threat hasn't gone away, it makes sense to have a look at Russia's capabilities. You've already talked about some of the long-range missiles, which could be a real threat to all of us. What is the state of Russia's armed forces after 3 years of war? Because there was a hope that perhaps the Russian military was deteriorating.
Well, it wasn't just a hope, it was a reality. The land forces with which Russia moved into Ukraine were swiftly eviscerated by the early stages of the fighting there. Let's not forget that Russia, after all, didn't actually expect to be fighting a war because they believed their own propaganda about being able to simply walk into Ukraine. The problem is that early setback for the Russian armed forces, the early demolition of their land forces, has left a lingering impression in some people that actually they are still broken and incapable today, which is not exactly the case because the land forces have been rebuilt. They have compensated for the massive numbers of casualties that they've been suffering. The result of that was that by May of 2024, Russia's land forces in Ukraine were actually already 15% larger than the ones that started the war. Now,
Wow.
larger but not the same in quality and not the same in equipment and not the same in approach. But this is accompanied by a process of Russia adapting to the war and in some cases falling back on Russia's traditional approach of treating manpower, treating individual humans as the most disposable commodity that a military has, but in other cases evolving to accommodate the sophistication of the new tools that they have, electronic warfare, drones. So when we think about the way in which Russia could start a conflict, we need to think about the totality of Russia's armed forces and not just their dwindling supply of antique tanks.
In the meantime, while Russia's military seems to have been doing surprisingly well during those 3 years of the Ukraine war, what's been happening to European defence?
It would be nice to think that more had been happening to European defense. It's hard, of course, to generalize across the continent because, as ever, there is a gradient from east to west. There are the countries closest to Russia that understand the challenge from Moscow and are determined to avoid it. So those countries are the ones which have poured the greatest amount of resources and attention into rebuilding their own defensive capacity. But then the countries west of Warsaw, with the exception of Norway, every other country has been in a state of semi-quiescence, still pretending that this is a problem that is years away. It's only just in recent weeks that we have seen, for instance, in the UK, the final grudging willingness to start increasing defense budgets by percentages, but not the kind of transformational investment that we've seen in those countries that take the threat more seriously.
And just to give our listeners some context around this, Keir Starmer has announced a commitment to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence. Apparently that actually means there would still be cuts to defence, even with that push. Give us a sense of where defence spending was as a proportion of GDP at the height of the Cold War, when there was a similar threat, and where you think realistically we need to be now in order to be able to meet the commitments that we have promised to NATO.
In terms of percentages of national wealth that was being spent on defense during the Cold War, 8 to 10% was far closer to the norm.
Wow.
In fact, there's been a reversal of the roles in terms of government spending in the UK, where the NHS has almost completely swapped places with defense in terms of the consumer of national wealth.
Do you think we need to get back to that kind of proportion in order to be able to defend ourselves now?
We hear a lot of analogies with the late 1930s now and the run-up to the Second World War. And of course, with the new Trump administration, the data points which support those analogies are coming thick and fast. We heard how Trump signing away part of Ukraine to try to appease Russia was a direct parallel with Neville Chamberlain giving away part of Czechoslovakia, hoping that that would stave off war with Hitler. One of the really important points to bear in mind when thinking about the 1930s is that in some ways we're in a much worse situation now than we were then. Because at that time, the UK was already well into a program of crash rearmament to get ready for the conflict that was coming. But here, we haven't even started. By the run-up to the Second World War, the defense spending was up to 10% or so of GDP. Just a couple of years later, it was consuming half of our national wealth. And that is the situation which we may face if there are not steps taken swiftly enough and urgently enough to deter a conflict as opposed to actually having to fight in one.
I mean, that's extraordinary when you think of it in such stark terms. For the UK, how dependent are we on the US when it comes to defence? I mean, if the US really is stepping back, if we find that they won't necessarily support us in any future war that we may end up having to fight, how much trouble are we in?
Well, this idea that has driven the design of the British Armed Forces, particularly the British Army, that it would only ever be fighting alongside other members of a coalition of which the United States would be the leading member. So if that's no longer the basic assumption around which British military power is structured, obviously a lot has to change, and the change is going to be traumatic and expensive. The problem comes, of course, if there is active US opposition to what any former partner military actually wants to do. If the United States is determined to force through Russia's outcomes for Ukraine, obviously Russia does not want to have a multinational peacekeeping force in Ukraine opposing what it may want to do in future, so it will try to block this, and past performance suggests that the United States would assist it in doing so. We could be in a situation where we are under attack by Russia, and the United States tries to prevent us from using the weapon systems that we have already bought and are in service to defend ourselves. And so many countries now are looking at the potential drawing back of the United States nuclear deterrent, under which the United States has explicitly protected other countries against nuclear attack, and are now thinking the only option for them might be to acquire their own nuclear weapons in order to arrange for their own defense in future and ensure that they can protect their sovereignty against threats that are backed up by nuclear intimidation.
This really is a reversal in recent history when we've all been about disarmament. That's countries who are covered by the promise of American nuclear protection. In Britain, we obviously have an independent nuclear deterrent, but how much of Trident, how much of it is actually tied up with America?
Well, that's a question that's seen very intensive debate over recent years precisely because of this issue, the question of whether the United States would be able to constrain the UK in defending itself using its supposedly independent nuclear deterrent. We may never actually know the real answer because there's a very good reason why these things are kept secret. But we do know that the UK has not gone down the path of complete independence from the United States in the way that, for example, France has. These are two supposedly independent nuclear deterrents which are structured in very different ways.
Keir, given where things stand, do you think there is a possibility that Europe could pull together and form a defence force effectively that would replace America in NATO, that would be NATO without America and still functional and still able to take on Russia? And if so, how long does that take?
If Europe cannot put together a viable force to defend itself, given the relative strength of its economies, given the advance warning time, then the legitimate question is, what exactly are the armed forces of European countries actually for? Yes, it may be necessary to find coalitions of the least unwilling to scrape that force together, particularly if the worst-case scenario does happen and the United States not only withdraws its backing from NATO, but also withdraws all of the different ways in which it has supported NATO.
You've talked about how European leaders haven't necessarily been psychologically ready to take on the challenge that now faces them. There's been a lot of burying of heads and ignoring the problem and hoping it goes away, a lot of wishful thinking. Do you think European populations are psychologically ready? You know, we hear a lot of young people, a lot of sort of Gen Z, don't even seem to necessarily back democracy. Do you think they're ready to fight if needed?
There's willingness to fight, and then there's basically being informed about the challenge that might mean that question is put to people in the first place. Actually making sure that people are aware of the threat. And in the second of those, there's been a clear deficit of leadership across Europe. Again, we have to be talking now about those countries that are west of Warsaw, because in the frontline states, the challenge is clear, the threat is clear, people understand what is at stake, and therefore there is by and large greater willingness to defend the country and defend the way of life that people have come to take for granted, their prosperity, their security, their liberty, all of which would be at risk if Moscow were to seek to re-establish its control over those countries. But west of Warsaw, there is a big gap in understanding of what that actually means. The basic problem is that any democracy is incapable of defending itself against a threat about which the majority of its voters are unaware, because of course they're not going to support the change and the funding and the societal disruption that is necessary to actually face the threat. So there's a very basic fundamental step of public education about which our leaders, particularly in Western Europe, have been delinquent.
So there's a huge job of educating the public. There's also a huge job of turning around defence, of investing more, of making sure we've got the kit that we can actually use on the front line, because it doesn't necessarily rely on America. How much time does Europe have to turn all of that around? Is it almost too late?
We've seen a lot of different estimates coming out over the last years from government agencies, from independent analysts across the whole of NATO, including the United States, for how long it would take Russia at the current rate to be ready to move against a NATO nation and when they might be willing to do so. And those estimates have been coming down rapidly. At the beginning of last year, beginning of 2024, there was talk of 10 to 20 years before Russia was able to reconstitute its forces and be ready to go. The speed with which Russia did that took a lot of people by surprise. By the middle of the year, those estimates had come down to 3 to 5 years. Most recently now, in February, we had a new assessment from the Danish Defense Intelligence Service talking about as little as 6 months before Russia is ready to make a move. And the biggest danger, of course, in an end to the fighting in Ukraine is that any ceasefire means that Ukraine will no longer be eroding and destroying Russia's armed forces, its land forces, almost as rapidly as Russia can rebuild them. As soon as that stops, Russia doesn't have that constraint on how rapidly it can get itself ready. That means the brakes are off and the clock is ticking.
That was Keir Giles, Russia watcher at Chatham House, whose latest book is about this very issue, and it's called Who Will Defend Europe? The producer today was Emily Webb. The executive producer was Fiona Leach. Sound design was by Tom Birchall, and the theme was composed by Mal Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get in touch with us about anything in this episode or any other, do drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.